Carl Jung's psychology begins with a disturbing truth. The parts of ourselves we refuse to see do not simply disappear. They continue to influence our choices, our relationships, our reactions, and eventually, our destiny. A person can speak with kindness while carrying resentment. They can promise loyalty while secretly competing with you. They can tell you that they love you while unconsciously punishing you for the very qualities that made them need you in the first place. This is where the psychology of narcissists and empaths becomes especially revealing, because sometimes the person who needs your understanding the most is the same person who eventually betrays it. And this contradiction is difficult to understand until you look beneath conscious behavior. Most people judge character through words. They listen to apologies. They remember promises. They pay attention to charming conversations, affectionate messages, public generosity, and carefully constructed impressions. But Jungian psychology asks us to look somewhere deeper. Not at what a person says they are, at what repeatedly happens when their unconscious patterns are activated. Because people can control their words. They can control their image. They can even control their behavior for a period of time. But pressure reveals patterns. Criticism reveals patterns. Jealousy reveals patterns. Power reveals patterns. And perhaps most importantly, intimacy reveals patterns. This is why first impressions can be dangerously incomplete. A narcissistic personality may initially appear confident, charismatic, protective, deeply interested, or unusually attentive. They may make another person feel fascinating, special, understood, even chosen. For an empath, this can be particularly powerful. An empath tends to notice emotional details that other people overlook. They hear the hesitation behind a sentence. They notice a change in someone's tone. They recognize pain beneath anger. They often understand what someone is feeling before that person has found the words to explain it. But this sensitivity has a hidden vulnerability. An empath may see someone's wounds and mistake those wounds for someone's character. They may think, they are not cruel, they are hurt. They are not distant. They are afraid. They are not manipulating me. They are protecting themselves. Sometimes that interpretation is compassionate and accurate, but sometimes it becomes the beginning of self-abandonment, because understanding why someone behaves badly does not make the behavior healthy. And this is where Carl Jung's concept of the persona becomes important. The persona is the psychological mask we present to the world. Every human being has one. It is not automatically dishonest. We all behave differently at work, with family, with friends. And when we are alone, the problem begins when the mask becomes more important than the person underneath it. A narcissistic individual may become heavily invested in maintaining an idealized identity. Successful, powerful, desirable, intelligent, generous, morally superior, emotionally strong, but beneath that persona can exist a fragile sense of self that cannot tolerate shame. And when reality threatens the persona, the unconscious begins defending it. This is where betrayal can emerge. The empath may become important because they provide validation, emotional support, admiration, forgiveness, stability, or understanding. But precisely because the empath sees beneath the surface, they can eventually become dangerous to the narcissist's psychological defenses. The empath notices inconsistencies. They remember what was said. They recognize emotional shifts. They see the difference between the public personality and the private one. And eventually, the person who once felt like a safe refuge can begin to feel like a psychological threat. This creates one of the strangest dynamics in human relationships. The narcissist may need the empath emotionally, yet resent the empath psychologically. They may depend upon their kindness while secretly envying it. They may seek their attention while becoming irritated by their emotional independence. They may want their forgiveness while punishing them for seeing too much. And the betrayal does not always happen because the empath was unimportant. Sometimes it happens because the empath became too important, because they became a mirror. And not everyone is willing to look into a mirror that shows them what they have spent years avoiding. But this is only the beginning. Because there is a deeper psychological mechanism that explains why certain people repeatedly reveal themselves through unconscious behavior long before they consciously admit who they are. And once you understand that mechanism, many confusing relationships begin to make sense. One of Jung's most important contributions to psychology was the idea that human beings are not completely governed by conscious intention. We like to believe that we know why we do what we do, but often, we know only the explanation our conscious mind creates afterward. The unconscious leaves fingerprints. A person may say, "I am happy for you," but their energy changes when you succeed. They may say, "I trust you," but they constantly test your loyalty. They may say, "I want you to be independent," but when you become independent, they suddenly become cold. They may insist, "I don't care what other people think." Yet criticism destroys their mood for days. The words describe one person. The patterns reveal another. This distinction is essential when trying to understand narcissistic behavior. A narcissistic person may genuinely believe their own narrative. That is one reason psychological manipulation can become so confusing. Not every manipulative person sits somewhere thinking, "Today I will manipulate someone." Human psychology is often less conscious than that. Defenses can become automatic, projection can become habitual, entitlement can become normalized. Avoidance can become instinctive, and the person may sincerely experience themselves as the victim while simultaneously harming another person. This is why empaths often sense something long before they can explain it. The empath notices the contradiction. Something feels wrong. Nothing obvious has happened. There is no dramatic confession. There may not even be a clear lie, but the emotional atmosphere changes. Imagine a woman in a relationship with a man who constantly tells her how much he appreciates her emotional intelligence. Whenever he is struggling, he calls her. Whenever he feels rejected, he seeks her reassurance. Whenever he has a problem, she listens. He tells her she is the only person who truly understands him. But then she begins expressing her own needs. Suddenly, the relationship changes. Her emotional needs are described as pressure. Her boundaries become selfishness. Her questions become accusations. Her independence becomes disrespect. The same qualities he once praised are now being criticized. Why? Because her empathy was useful when it regulated his emotions, but her individuality threatens his control. This is where unconscious patterns become visible. A healthy relationship can tolerate two realities at once. I can understand your pain, and you can still be responsible for how you treat me. A psychologically unhealthy relationship often demands something different. Because I am hurting, you must stop having needs. That is not empathy. That is emotional dependency disguised as intimacy. Another example can happen in friendship. A friend constantly comes to you for advice. You listen for hours. You help them through breakups, financial stress, family conflicts, and personal insecurity. But the moment you accomplish something meaningful, they become strangely dismissive. Your promotion is luck. Your relationship is temporary. Your success is exaggerated. Your confidence is arrogance. You begin noticing a pattern. They want access to your emotional strength, but they do not always celebrate your growth. This is where jealousy can reveal the unconscious. A person may consciously love you while unconsciously competing with you. Both experiences can exist at the same time. Human beings are complicated. This is why psychological analysis should not reduce every difficult person to a simple label. The goal is not to say, everyone who behaves badly is a narcissist. The goal is to recognize repeated patterns. Does someone take responsibility? Can they tolerate your boundaries? Can they apologize without turning the conversation back onto you? Can they celebrate your success without making it about themselves? Can they remain respectful when they are disappointed? Can they hear criticism without immediately attacking the person delivering it? These questions reveal more than charming words ever could, because character is not most visible when everything is going well. Character becomes visible when the ego feels threatened, and that leads to the next psychological sign. There is a particular moment when the carefully constructed personality begins to crack. It happens when the person experiences something they cannot easily control. Criticism, rejection, comparison, failure, or the success of someone close to them, and what emerges in that moment can reveal far more than the mask ever did. People often reveal themselves most clearly when they cannot control the situation. When everything goes according to plan, almost anyone can appear patient. Almost anyone can appear generous. Almost anyone can appear emotionally mature. But remove control. Introduce disappointment. Give them criticism. Allow someone else to receive attention. And suddenly the hidden structure becomes visible. This is one of the most important psychological principles for understanding relationships. Do not study only how someone treats you when they want something from you. Study how they behave when you say no. That single word can reveal an enormous amount about a person's psychological structure. A healthy person may feel disappointed. They may become frustrated. They may need time to process rejection. But eventually they can recognize your right to make your own decision. A psychologically controlling person experiences your boundary differently. Your no feels like an attack. Your independence feels like rejection. Your disagreement feels like disrespect. Your success feels like competition. Your criticism feels like humiliation, and the emotional response becomes disproportionate to the situation. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes useful. The shadow represents aspects of ourselves that we do not comfortably acknowledge. Every person has one. The compassionate person can have anger in the shadow. The confident person can carry insecurity. The generous person can carry envy. The successful person can secretly fear failure. Having a shadow does not make someone evil. The problem is refusing to recognize it. Because what we refuse to acknowledge consciously can begin controlling us unconsciously. A narcissistic pattern often involves a powerful conflict between the idealized self and the disowned self. The person wants to experience themselves as superior, desirable, strong, intelligent, or morally correct. But beneath that identity may exist feelings of inadequacy, shame, dependency, fear, or vulnerability. Those feelings can become intolerable, so instead of confronting them, the mind searches for somewhere else to place them. This is where projection enters. Someone who cannot tolerate feeling inadequate may become obsessed with proving that someone else is inadequate. Someone who secretly envies another person's confidence may accuse that person of arrogance. Someone who fears abandonment may constantly accuse their partner of being unfaithful. Someone who feels emotionally dependent may call the other person needy. The unconscious moves the painful feeling outward, and the person experiences the external target as the problem. This is why criticism can be so revealing. Suppose a manager constantly praises themselves as a team player. But whenever another employee receives recognition, they become cold. They interrupt that employee in meetings. They minimize their contribution. They subtly remind everyone of their own authority. Consciously, they may believe they are simply maintaining standards. Unconsciously, however, the success of another person may be activating an old wound. The other person's achievement becomes a mirror. It reflects something the manager does not want to feel. I might not be as important as I need to believe I am. That thought can be painful, so instead of processing it, the mind attacks the mirror. This dynamic also appears in intimate relationships. A partner may say, "You have changed." Sometimes that is true, but sometimes what they mean is, "You no longer respond to me the way you used to." The empath who once apologized for everything begins setting boundaries. They stop explaining themselves. They stop chasing after emotional withdrawal. They stop trying to rescue every conflict. And suddenly the relationship becomes unstable. Why? Because one person's healing can disturb another person's psychological comfort. When you become healthier, relationships built around your unhealthy patterns may no longer function. That does not mean every person who dislikes your boundaries is a narcissist. Some people simply need time to adjust. Others may genuinely disagree with you. But repeated punishment for having reasonable boundaries is different. Repeated guilt, repeated silent treatment, repeated character attacks, repeated attempts to make you question your memory, repeated efforts to isolate you from other relationships. These are patterns worth taking seriously, and this is where the difference between authenticity and performance becomes crucial. An authentic person does not need to be perfect. They can be jealous and admit it. They can become angry and apologize. They can make mistakes and repair them. They can say, "I was wrong." A person trapped inside a rigid persona has more difficulty doing this because admitting the mistake does not merely mean admitting an action was wrong. It can feel like admitting the entire identity is wrong, and that is unbearable for an ego built around being superior, innocent, or always justified. This brings us directly into the strange relationship between the narcissist and the empath, because the empath often becomes the person who sees the mask most clearly. And that is precisely why the relationship can become so intense. The narcissist and the empath can appear like opposites. One seems self-focused. The other seems deeply focused on others. One seeks admiration. The other seeks emotional understanding. One may avoid vulnerability. The other may feel everything intensely. But beneath the surface, their dynamic can become psychologically intertwined. The empath often possesses something the narcissistic personality desperately needs: emotional regulation through connection, attention validation, understanding, forgiveness, admiration, emotional availability. The empath can become a psychological source of reassurance. But there is a paradox. The narcissistic personality may need the empath while simultaneously resenting the empath's emotional qualities. Why? because the qualities that make the empath valuable can also expose the narcissist's internal insecurity. Imagine someone who has spent years building a powerful identity. Everyone sees confidence, but their partner sees fear. Everyone sees charm, but their partner sees insecurity. Everyone sees generosity, but their partner sees the resentment that appears when nobody applauds. The partner becomes a witness to the difference between persona and reality, and being truly seen can be frightening, especially when the person has built their identity around never being exposed. This helps explain why some narcissistic relationships follow a recognizable emotional cycle. At first, the empath may be idealized. You are different, you understand me. I have never met someone like you. You are the only person I can trust. The empath feels deeply valued, but psychologically, something else may be happening. The narcissistic person has found a person who can provide emotional nourishment. Then intimacy increases. The empath begins noticing contradictions. They ask questions, they express needs. They become less impressed by the persona and more interested in the person underneath. This can create tension. The idealization begins to weaken. The same person who was once called amazing may now be called too sensitive. The same empathy that was once praised becomes emotional weakness. The same independence that was admired becomes selfishness. The relationship has shifted. But the empath may not understand why. They often begin searching for the version of the person they first met. They think, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe they are stressed. Maybe if I communicate better, things will return to normal. This is where manipulation can become powerful, not necessarily because every narcissistic person consciously plans each step, but because the relationship can become organized around one person's emotional regulation. When the narcissist withdraws, the empath chases. When the narcissist becomes angry, the empath explains. When the narcissist accuses, the empath defends. When the narcissist becomes distant, the empath tries harder. And slowly, the empath begins living in reaction to another person's emotional state. That is the psychological trap. The empath thinks they are preserving the relationship, but they may actually be abandoning themselves to preserve emotional stability. Consider a woman whose partner becomes cold whenever she disagrees with him. At first, she tries to communicate, then she starts choosing her words carefully, then she avoids certain subjects. Then she apologizes even when she does not believe she did anything wrong. Eventually, she is no longer asking, "What do I feel?" She is asking, "What will keep him calm?" That is a profound psychological shift. Her attention has moved from self-awareness to emotional surveillance, and this is where an empath can become vulnerable. Their sensitivity, which was once a gift, becomes directed entirely outward. They become experts at reading everyone except themselves. But the story does not end there. The empath can begin waking up. They notice that the relationship requires endless understanding, but provides little accountability. They notice that compassion moves in only one direction. They notice that their partner wants forgiveness but resists responsibility, and something inside them changes. They stop asking, "How can I make this person understand me?" They begin asking, "Why am I continuing to abandon myself to be understood?" That question can change everything, because recognizing narcissistic patterns is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about becoming psychologically awake. You do not need to diagnose another person to recognize that a relationship is damaging you. You do not need a label to justify a boundary. You do not need to prove that someone is toxic before protecting your peace. And this leads to the deeper Jungian lesson. The greatest transformation does not happen when you finally understand the other person's shadow. It happens when you become willing to examine your own. There is a dangerous temptation in psychological content. Once you learn about narcissism, projection, manipulation, and the shadow, you may begin seeing narcissists everywhere. Your difficult coworker becomes a narcissist. Your emotionally distant partner becomes a narcissist. Your critical friend becomes a narcissist. Anyone who disagrees with you becomes psychologically damaged. But that is not Jungian self-awareness. That is another form of projection. Jung's deeper message was not simply, study other people's darkness. It was, study your own. Because the unconscious does not only exist inside difficult people, it exists inside all of us. The shadow is not a monster living inside someone else. It is the part of ourselves we would rather not acknowledge. And relationships bring that shadow into consciousness. Someone may make you intensely angry. Ask why. Someone may make you feel inferior. Ask why. Someone's confidence may irritate you. Someone's success may trigger jealousy. Someone's rejection may feel unbearable. The goal is not to shame yourself for these emotions. The goal is to become curious about them, because self-awareness begins when we stop treating every emotional reaction as proof that someone else is the problem. This becomes particularly important in empathic personalities. An empath may be highly perceptive but still have unresolved psychological patterns. They may have learned that love means rescuing. They may have learned that being needed means being valuable. They may confuse patience with endurance. They may confuse forgiveness with tolerating repeated harm. They may feel guilty whenever they prioritize themselves. These patterns can unconsciously attract relationships where their emotional labor becomes excessive. Again, this does not mean the empath caused the manipulation. Responsibility for abuse remains with the person choosing abusive behavior. But self-awareness asks a different question. Why did I remain available to this pattern for so long? That question is not self-blame. It is freedom, because if you only say, they were terrible, then your healing remains dependent on understanding them. But when you ask, what did I need, fear, believe, or tolerate? You begin recovering your own psychological power. This is where persona and authentic self become important. Perhaps your persona is the endlessly understanding person, the calm person, the forgiving person, the person who never causes problems, the person who can handle everything. That identity may have helped you survive difficult situations, but it can become a prison, because eventually you may become afraid to express anger, afraid to disappoint people, afraid to say no, afraid to be misunderstood, afraid that setting a boundary will make someone leave. So the persona of the good person begins suppressing authentic emotions. And what happens to suppressed emotions? They do not disappear. They enter the shadow. Eventually, the empath who has spent years swallowing anger may explode. The person who has always said yes may suddenly disappear from relationships without explanation. The person who constantly forgives may become emotionally numb. This is why integration is healthier than repression. You do not need to become cruel to become strong. You do not need to stop caring. You do not need to become emotionally detached. You need to become whole. Wholeness means being capable of compassion and boundaries, kindness and discernment, forgiveness and consequences, love and self-respect. You can understand someone's childhood and still refuse their mistreatment. You can recognize someone's trauma and still hold them accountable. You can feel empathy without offering unlimited access to yourself. This is psychological maturity. And perhaps the most profound realization is this. Sometimes people betray us because they cannot tolerate what our presence reflects back to them. But sometimes we remain in unhealthy relationships because we cannot tolerate what leaving reflects back to us. Leaving may force us to confront loneliness. It may force us to admit that the relationship we hoped for never existed. It may force us to grieve the person we believed someone could become. That grief can be painful, but it can also be transformative, because once the fantasy disappears, reality becomes visible. And reality, although painful, gives you something fantasy never can, the ability to choose. The goal of healing is not to become impossible to hurt. It is to become difficult to manipulate. There is a difference. A person who becomes cold may stop trusting everyone. A person who becomes psychologically strong learns to trust selectively. They do not close the door to love, they install a door. And they learn that they are allowed to decide who receives the key. This is one of the most important transformations for an empath. Your empathy does not need to disappear. It needs boundaries. You can listen without absorbing. You can care without rescuing. You can forgive without reopening the same wound. You can understand someone without becoming responsible for their emotional state. This begins with observing patterns instead of chasing explanations. If someone repeatedly disrespects your boundaries, pay attention. If they apologize only when they fear losing access to you, pay attention. If their kindness disappears whenever they are not getting what they want, pay attention. If they celebrate your achievements only when those achievements do not threaten their position, pay attention. If every conflict somehow ends with you apologizing for their behavior, pay attention. You are not required to diagnose the person. You are required to notice the pattern. Healthy relationships have something extremely important in common. Reciprocity. Both people can have needs. Both can make mistakes. Both can become defensive. Both can experience difficult emotions. But both are capable of returning to responsibility. A genuine person does not need to win every disagreement. They can say, I misunderstood you. I reacted badly. I was jealous. I was afraid. I hurt you. I need to do better. These sentences are psychologically powerful because they demonstrate self-awareness. A person who can recognize their own shadow is less controlled by it. That does not make them perfect. It makes repair possible. So how can an empath recognize genuine people? Watch what happens when they are disappointed. Watch how they treat people who cannot benefit them. Watch whether they respect boundaries. Watch whether they can celebrate another person's success. Watch whether they can disagree without humiliating. Watch whether their private behavior matches their public identity. And most importantly, watch whether you feel increasingly like yourself around them. Healthy relationships do not require you to disappear. You should not have to become smaller so another person can feel larger. You should not have to silence your intelligence to protect someone's ego. You should not have to hide your happiness because another person cannot tolerate it. And you should not have to constantly prove your loyalty to someone who repeatedly creates reasons for you to doubt theirs. Protecting your emotional energy does not mean becoming selfish. It means recognizing that your inner world is also a responsibility. There is another important shift that occurs when self-awareness grows. You stop asking only, "Why did they do this to me?" and begin asking, "What does this experience teach me about my patterns?" Maybe you learn that you over-explain. Maybe you learn that you ignore early discomfort. Maybe you learn that you confuse chemistry with safety. Maybe you learn that you give people access faster than they earn trust. Maybe you learn that you are more comfortable being needed than being loved as an equal. These realizations can hurt, but they also give you choices. The unconscious becomes less powerful when it becomes conscious. Once you recognize your pattern, you can interrupt it. You can pause before responding. You can observe instead of reacting. You can ask yourself what you actually feel. You can stop trying to convince someone who has already shown you their position through repeated behavior. And eventually, something beautiful happens. You no longer need to become hard to become safe. You become discerning. You still feel deeply, but you no longer allow every feeling to dictate your decisions. You still love, but you no longer confuse love with self-sacrifice. You still forgive, but you understand that forgiveness does not erase consequences. And you still believe in people's capacity to change, but you no longer build your life around who someone might become. That is the difference between empathy without boundaries and mature empathy. And when that transformation occurs, the meaning of betrayal itself begins to change, because you stop seeing every betrayal as proof that you were foolish to trust. You begin seeing it as information, painful information, but information that reveals what was hidden, and sometimes, what hurts you is also what finally wakes you up. There comes a moment in psychological growth when you stop asking someone to reveal themselves. You simply observe. You no longer need the perfect confession. You no longer need the dramatic explanation. You no longer need them to admit what they did before you trust your own experience. You begin understanding something Jungian psychology has emphasized for generations. What remains unconscious often speaks through repetition, the same conflict, the same reaction, the same accusation, the same emotional withdrawal, the same broken promise, the same cycle. A single mistake may be human. A repeated pattern is information. And perhaps this is the hidden lesson behind narcissists betraying empaths. The betrayal is not always about the value of the empath. Sometimes it is about the narcissistic person's inability to tolerate what the empath represents. The empath may represent emotional depth, accountability, authenticity. A mirror without flattering distortion, and when someone has built their identity around a persona, an honest mirror can feel threatening. But there is another side to this story. The empath's greatest awakening is realizing that being able to understand someone's pain does not mean they are obligated to live inside it. You can know why someone became the way they are without allowing them to decide who you become. You can recognize their shadow without carrying it. You can understand their wounds without becoming their emotional medicine. You can love someone and still leave. You can forgive someone and still maintain distance. You can wish someone healing without volunteering to be wounded by them again. This is where self-awareness becomes freedom, because the deepest psychological transformation is not learning how to identify narcissists. It is learning how to identify yourself. What do you tolerate? What do you fear? What do you chase? What do you excuse? What kind of behavior makes you abandon your own intuition? What part of you still believes that if you love someone deeply enough, they will eventually become safe? These questions are uncomfortable, but discomfort is not always a warning. Sometimes discomfort is consciousness arriving. The empath who becomes self-aware no longer needs to become less sensitive. They become more discerning about where their sensitivity belongs. They understand that not everyone deserves access to their deepest emotional world. They stop measuring love by how much pain they can survive. They begin measuring relationships by how safe they are allowed to be, and perhaps that is the real victory. Not revenge, not proving the narcissist wrong, not making them regret losing you. Those goals still keep your psychological attention attached to them. Freedom is different. Freedom is when their behavior no longer determines your sense of worth. When their approval no longer defines your identity. When their rejection no longer becomes a verdict on your value. When their betrayal no longer convinces you that your capacity to love was a weakness. Your empathy was never the enemy. Unconscious empathy without boundaries can become dangerous. But conscious empathy is different. It has eyes, it has limits, it has discernment, it knows when to stay and when to walk away. Carl Jung's psychological vision ultimately points us toward integration. The goal is not to destroy the shadow. It is to become conscious of it, not to eliminate vulnerability, but to understand it, not to stop loving people, but to stop abandoning yourself in the process. And perhaps the most important relationship you will ever examine is not the relationship between you and the narcissist. It is the relationship between you and yourself. Because when you finally become honest with yourself, manipulation becomes harder to sustain. You begin noticing what your intuition has been whispering. You recognize the difference between someone's words and their patterns. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop confusing being needed with being loved. You stop trying to rescue people who are committed to repeating the same cycle. And you begin choosing relationships where your empathy is not exploited but respected. Where your boundaries are not punished but understood. Where your success is not threatening but celebrated. Where vulnerability is not weaponized. Where love does not require you to disappear. Perhaps that is the final psychological awakening. The right people do not need you to become smaller so they can feel whole. And the people who betray you do not necessarily reveal that you were foolish for trusting. Sometimes they reveal something about themselves that you are finally ready to see. But the deepest lesson is not about them, it is about you. The moment you become conscious of your patterns, you stop calling them fate. You stop repeating what you once thought was normal. You stop chasing masks, you stop negotiating with contradictions. And slowly, almost silently, you begin returning to yourself. Because the greatest form of emotional freedom is not becoming someone who never gets hurt. It is becoming someone who can feel deeply without losing themselves. Someone who can love without surrendering their identity. Someone who can understand another person's darkness without becoming trapped inside it. And perhaps that is where the real journey begins. Not when you finally understand why they betrayed you, but when you finally understand why their betrayal no longer has the power to define you. The deepest lesson is not simply that narcissists betray empaths. The deeper lesson is understanding why the empath remains emotionally connected to someone who repeatedly hurts them. At first, the relationship can feel unusually powerful. The empath sees potential where others see problems. They notice the narcissist's wounds, insecurities, fears, and moments of vulnerability. Instead of judging them, the empath tries to understand them. They think, maybe there is a good person underneath all of this. And sometimes there is. But understanding someone's wounds does not mean you are responsible for healing them. This is where many empaths lose themselves. They begin confusing compassion with responsibility. They believe that if they love harder, communicate better, forgive more, remain patient, or prove their loyalty, the relationship will eventually become what they hoped it could be. But a relationship cannot be transformed by one person's awareness alone. You can understand someone's trauma without accepting their destructive behavior. You can recognize someone's pain without allowing that pain to become an excuse for hurting you. You can have empathy without surrendering your boundaries. This is one of the most important psychological lessons hidden inside the narcissist-empath dynamic. The empath often asks, "Why did they do this to me?" But eventually, the more powerful question becomes, "Why am I continuing to participate in something that keeps hurting me?" That question changes everything. Carl Jung's psychological perspective can help us understand why. Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we refuse to recognize can influence our behavior from the unconscious. We may project qualities onto other people, idealize them, fear them, or become emotionally attached to patterns that feel strangely familiar. The empath may unconsciously believe that being needed means being valuable. So when the narcissist needs them, the empath feels important. When the narcissist withdraws, the empath feels rejected. When the narcissist returns, the empath feels relief. And this creates an emotional cycle. Konnachtstand, pain, hope, reconnection, pain again. The relationship becomes less about genuine intimacy and more about emotional conditioning. The empath starts waiting for the next moment of affection. They become highly sensitive to changes in tone, attention, messages, and behavior. They analyze every interaction. Why did they suddenly become cold? Did I do something wrong? Why are they affectionate today but distant tomorrow? This constant uncertainty can become psychologically exhausting, and that is why betrayal can feel so devastating. The empath isn't only losing a person. They are losing the future they imagined. They are grieving the version of the relationship they believed was possible. They are grieving the person they thought existed underneath the behavior. And sometimes, they are grieving the version of themselves that existed before the relationship. But betrayal can also become a moment of awakening, because eventually the empath realizes something painful. The person they were trying to save may never have been asking to be saved. The narcissist's behavior belongs to the narcissist. The empath's responsibility is not to diagnose, repair, rescue, or redeem another person. Their responsibility is to protect their own psychological integrity. That means learning the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. Compassion says, I understand why you are hurting. Self-abandonment says, because you are hurting, I will allow you to hurt me. Those are not the same thing. A healthy person can have compassion while maintaining boundaries. They can say, I understand your pain, but I will not accept being treated this way. That sentence represents emotional maturity. The empath's greatest transformation begins when they stop measuring their worth by how much pain they can tolerate. They stop thinking that endurance proves love. They stop believing that forgiveness requires unlimited access. They stop confusing being needed with being loved, and they stop chasing explanations from someone whose behavior has already provided the answer. The lesson is not to become cold. The lesson is to become clear. You don't need to stop caring. You need to stop abandoning yourself while caring. You don't need to become cruel. You need boundaries. You don't need revenge. You need distance when distance is necessary. And you don't need to prove that you were good enough. Your worth was never determined by someone's ability to recognize it. The narcissist's betrayal may have been painful, but the real victory begins when the empath stops allowing that betrayal to define their identity. Because sometimes the greatest psychological awakening begins with a simple realization. I can love people without losing myself to them. The second lesson is about boundaries. Many people hear the word boundary and imagine walls, anger, rejection, or emotional coldness. But a boundary is not punishment. A boundary is information. It tells another person, this is what I will accept, and this is what I will not accept. For the empath, learning boundaries can feel uncomfortable because they may have spent years prioritizing everyone else's emotions. They may be used to saying, it's okay, don't worry, I understand. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe they're going through something. Maybe I should give them another chance. But there comes a point where understanding becomes denial. If someone repeatedly lies, manipulates, humiliates, threatens, uses guilt, disappears, returns, and repeats the same pattern, the empath must stop focusing only on the person's explanation and start looking at the person's pattern. Because patterns reveal what individual moments can hide. Anyone can apologize. Anyone can promise to change. Anyone can become emotional after hurting someone. But genuine change requires consistent behavior over time. This is another powerful lesson. Don't judge transformation by words. Judge it by patterns. A person who genuinely changes does not simply say, I'll never do that again. Their behavior becomes different. They accept responsibility. They stop blaming everyone else. They respect boundaries. They tolerate consequences. They don't demand immediate forgiveness. They don't punish you for protecting yourself. They don't manipulate you into feeling guilty for their actions. And most importantly, they don't repeatedly recreate the same cycle. This is where the empath must become psychologically observant. Instead of asking, do they still love me? Ask, how do I consistently feel around them? Do you feel safe? Do you feel respected? Can you speak honestly? Can you say no? Can you have your own opinions? Can you make mistakes without being punished? Can you have boundaries without being accused of being selfish? Can you express hurt without being manipulated into apologizing for having feelings? These questions are more valuable than trying to decode someone's hidden intentions. Because sometimes we become obsessed with understanding the person who hurt us, while completely ignoring what the relationship is doing to us. The empath must also learn that not every connection deserves unlimited access. Some people are lessons, some are temporary companions, some relationships are meant to teach you something and then end. And some people may only remain in your life when you stop giving them unlimited emotional access. This is not about labeling everyone as a narcissist. In fact, one of the healthiest lessons is to avoid turning psychological labels into weapons. Not every selfish person is a narcissist. Not every difficult relationship is narcissistic abuse. Not every betrayal comes from narcissism. Human beings are complicated. People make mistakes. People become defensive. People have wounds. People can change. Psychology should help us understand behavior, not encourage us to reduce every person to a diagnosis. The goal is not to become obsessed with identifying narcissists. The goal is to become better at recognizing unhealthy patterns. That distinction matters. Because once you start developing psychological awareness, you don't need to spend every day wondering, is this person a narcissist? You can simply ask, is this relationship healthy for me? That question is enough. The empath also needs to understand the danger of the rescue fantasy. The rescue fantasy says, if I love them enough, they will change. But love cannot substitute for someone's willingness to change. You can inspire someone. You can support someone. You can encourage someone. But you cannot do their inner work for them. Every adult is ultimately responsible for confronting their own shadow. This connects beautifully with Jung's concept of the shadow. The shadow represents aspects of ourselves that we may deny, repress, or refuse to acknowledge. Real psychological growth requires bringing those unconscious parts into awareness. But the empath must be careful not to turn another person's shadow into their personal mission. You cannot integrate someone else's shadow for them. You cannot force another person into self-awareness. You cannot love someone into emotional maturity. And you cannot sacrifice your identity to prove that you are compassionate. Your job is to confront your own patterns. Why did you ignore the warning signs? Why did you keep explaining someone's behavior? Why did you believe promises more than patterns? Why did their approval become so important? Why did rejection feel unbearable? Why did you feel responsible for their emotions? These questions are not about blaming yourself. They are about reclaiming yourself. Self-reflection should never become self-hatred. The purpose is not, what is wrong with me? The healthier question is, what can I understand about myself now that I couldn't understand before? That is growth. Maybe you discover that you were afraid of abandonment. Maybe you discovered that you learned early in life to keep peace at any cost. Maybe you discovered that being needed made you feel valuable. Maybe you were uncomfortable with conflict. Maybe you confused intensity with intimacy. Whatever the pattern is, awareness gives you a choice. And once you see the pattern, you don't have to repeat it. This is perhaps the greatest lesson an empath can learn. You are allowed to choose yourself without becoming selfish. You can leave without hating. You can forgive without returning. You can understand without excusing. You can love someone from a distance. And you can walk away without needing them to agree that you were right. Sometimes closure does not come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure comes from understanding yourself. The moment you no longer need the narcissist to admit what they did, apologize perfectly, explain everything, or validate your experience, they lose their psychological power over you. That is freedom. The final lesson is perhaps the most important one. The goal is not to defeat the narcissist. The goal is to stop living inside the narcissist's psychological world. Many people remain emotionally trapped long after the relationship has ended. They replay conversations. They imagine what they should have said. They wonder whether the narcissist misses them. They check whether the person has changed. They imagine the person regretting what they did. They fantasize about the narcissist coming back and finally realizing their value. But this can become another form of attachment. The person may be physically gone, but psychologically they are still occupying the mind. True healing begins when the question changes. Instead of, will they ever realize what they lost? You begin asking, why should my healing depend on their realization? That is the turning point. You don't need the narcissist to understand your value. You don't need them to regret their behavior. You don't need them to admit they manipulated you. You don't need them to become the person you hoped they would become. And you don't need revenge, because revenge keeps you psychologically connected. Freedom does the opposite. Freedom says, "You no longer control the direction of my life." This is where the empath's sensitivity becomes a strength again. Empathy itself was never the problem. The problem was empathy without boundaries. Sensitivity was never weakness. The problem was allowing sensitivity to override judgment. Kindness was never the mistake. The mistake was believing that kindness required self-sacrifice. Once the empath learns this distinction, something changes internally. They become quieter. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop chasing people who repeatedly withdraw. They stop trying to prove that they are worthy of love. They become less impressed by intense words and more attentive to consistent behavior. They begin recognizing emotional manipulation earlier. They notice when someone uses guilt instead of communication. They recognize when affection becomes a reward for obedience. They notice when silence is being used as punishment. They recognize when someone repeatedly crosses boundaries and then blames them for reacting. And because they recognize